CJUS 335. In this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about fraud and theft from religious groups. This can apply equally to nonprofit organizations, but my research in the last couple of years has really focused on this group primarily. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So today we're going to talk briefly about who steals from places of worship like churches, synagogues, mosques, any kind of religious organization. Then we're also going to talk about how specifically they steal, what it is that they do in order to get the money or the items. We'll also talk about the impact that it has, because it does have a really significant impact, and we'll talk through some of the prevention strategies, the controls that are in place and can be in place to help with this. And of course, we'll present some case studies. As I said, really my exposure, my experience, my research has really been tailored to the religious communities, the faith organizations, because I feel like there's something really interesting about them. But when you look at it, because it impacts all denominations everywhere across the globe, you also see that the exact same issues apply equally to nonprofit organizations, charities, foundations, things that really rely on public support. And so that's where some of the most interesting things happen. So let's go ahead and move on. All of the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and every other religion generally has a very strong belief that stealing is bad. And obviously it really is a moral issue for everyone, in that it is generally not something that is acceptable in any circumstance. What I found through my research over the last couple years is that it really can wreak havoc within organizations, within churches, within synagogues, within faith communities. It causes a tremendous upheaval and a huge loss of trust. So it really has a wide-ranging impact, not just specifically on the amount of money that's been stolen, but also everything else across the board. And it really does harm society, because most of the time these organizations are set up to help the poor, the less fortunate, to do their mission and fulfill a societal need. So if we look at Judeo-Christian history as an example, and we've cited some of the Leviticus Old Testament text, you also see this. There's very interesting historical issues here. Lots of problems, lots of all kinds of just awful things, and much of it comes back to money. And of course, in the Ten Commandments, Moses lays out that thou shalt not steal. He also specifically says taking or receiving bribes is prohibited. And of course, all the other Old Testament books are very clear about this. In the New Testament, Judas, the Iscariot, is the one who has the common purse. He's the treasurer, and he is in the Bible, in the New Testament, says that he is stealing money prior to his betrayal of Jesus, and of course he does that for his own personal benefit. 30 pieces of silver. Interestingly enough, there is another story in the Bible where an individual named Simon the magician tries to essentially bribe his way into becoming a disciple, and getting the I guess the honorarium of that position, and it does not work. But it's very interesting to see the history of how many of these things come together, and it really sets us up for some of the issues that we'll talk about soon. So when I review these cases, and I do it fairly frequently, I've written a number of pieces about this type of crime, and it really comes down to the one thing I always notice is there are a lot of very, very trusting people. It all comes down to positions of authority, many of whom are clerics, so priests and nuns and imams and rabbis and although pastors, they have a position of authority. Lay leaders, staff, everyone has trust that they are going to do the right thing, and because there is a faith and a belief that there's a moral underpinning to everything, when it happens, it is catastrophic in many places. It is, you see parishes or congregations fracture, and some churches that are non-denominational or aren't affiliated with a larger organization just dissolve because they cannot bounce back from a scandal like this. So there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. As you can see here, I include a portion of one of my articles where we talked about affinity fraud. And affinity fraud is essentially a fraud that targets people usually based on the same faith or the belief that that other person has the same faith. So, for example, a Ponzi scheme could be useful to target the members of your congregation. Unfortunately, this in the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake, has a pretty big issue with this, actually to the point where Utah is the only state that has a white-collar crime registry, just like sex offender registries, because people have been preyed on so often, and they are so trusting. It really makes it very difficult. So there is a very target-rich environment because of this kind of commonality, if you will. So it's a very, very difficult area. For example, Bernie Madoff used his Jewish faith as an affinity to enable him to target other charities to invest in his Ponzi scheme, and very, very faithful people. So it is a huge, huge issue, and it's something that sometimes is not very well addressed. So, who steals from the church? We've kind of talked through some of this, but I want to lay this out in a very kind of framework for you. So basically, it really can be anybody. All you need is access, motivation, some kind of need, and a huge lack of integrity. I kind of break it down by insiders, outsiders, affiliates, and kind of an other category. So as you can see under insiders, clergy, business managers are probably the most likely. They certainly have the access, and if they have the need or the perceived need, and they can wreak havoc quite easily. And when I did some research and started putting the numbers together, it really was the cases that were reported. Primarily, the offenders were in this general category, and pretty much in this order. Maybe the business manager may have had a little bit more in terms of the money, but certainly any kind of staff with access to the financials. Then you also have your outsiders, so vendors and contractors can obviously commit fraud. Transients can try to come in and steal items or other, the collection basket. Sometimes people who are in need of social services, or purportedly in need of social services, I should say, approach the church or the religious organization to help them, and sometimes they are not who they really say they are. So then you have the typical slip and fall insurance fraud type schemes and things of that nature. Affiliates are an interesting category because this is another area where we really see, when I was doing my research, a lot of schools and daycares, because they are very well connected, often very closely connected to the church or the religious organization itself. And then of course you have all these other ministries or volunteers who have access to money, and so those kind of would fall into the affiliate category. And then certainly then you have these others. We talked about the Ponzi schemers who are seeking to do affinity fraud. You also have this charity gaming theft, and this is actually how I got interested in a lot of this, because especially in Michigan, I've noticed there were a lot of cases involving this very issue. So a special men's group or a organization that is closely related to the church or to another nonprofit organization get a charity gaming license, and then basically they steal from it. So it's a moneymaker, but not necessarily in the good way. So when you're looking at exactly where these things tend to happen, basically, obviously, there's the collection and counting area that you want to be concerned about. This is, where in a church they are passing the basket around and collecting usually cash donations. Then certainly having someone who is an usher or has access to this can then literally steal it from the collection plate. Also notice there are clergy discretionary funds, and often this is usually in a legitimate situation. This is because this is useful for extreme financial emergencies that the pastor needs to have essentially confidentiality to help a parishioner. And this is legitimate. This does happen a lot, but this, of course, can be a very difficult area, and it could be fraught with problems if it's not done correctly. Then, of course, you have the checks that are written to self or to pay bills on the fraudster's behalf. Same thing, you can use credit cards in the name of the church or organization, debit cards, and just making straight ATM withdrawals, wire transfers, and electronic transfers as well. And then this idea of using affiliated bank accounts. So for example, I'll give you an example for me. The church that I go to has a men's group and a women's group, and every man over 18 and every woman over 18 are members respectively of each group. And so when the men's group that puts on the fish fries collect the money, it goes into their bank account. But because they are so closely aligned with the church, that the names are very similar, it is not necessarily, and technically, I should say, technically they are separate organizations. Although they are so closely affiliated with it, some people may not make that distinction. But certainly this is another avenue that people could use. So there may be strong controls within the organization itself, but those affiliates or auxiliaries may not have that same level of oversight. So how do you control these? So first of all, it takes really thoughtful leadership. You want to make sure that you use good internal controls, things like rotating duties, having multiple counters, having a random assignment, doing spot checks, looking at credit cards, looking at bank statements. Bank statements are probably the quickest way that many of these issues are found, and so that becomes another issue as well. So you want to be able to have good audit, good oversight, good leadership to help maintain these internal controls. And obviously, you don't want just one person to have full access to everything. So I find it interesting that the word bishop is actually of Greek origin, and it means overseer, meaning to observe or supervise. Of course, this means that, like we just said, having these effective leadership and oversight issues in place, good policies, good procedures, good idea that if somebody finds out, they're going to get caught and something bad is going to happen. There could be pretty good ways to report these through the police or to other law enforcement agencies when it happens. That certainly should happen. Of course, this becomes a very emotional issue for sure. But having these controls in place, being open, being transparent, having good audit or very well done reviews are essential. So I like to say that trust is not an internal control. I stole that from somebody. It's been around for a long time. If you think about it, religious organization or nonprofit is just like any other entity or organization or business. We have to hold people accountable. We have to be able to have a good system in place. We have to be able to look at background checks to make sure that appropriate people have appropriate access. The use of litigation when things do go wrong, to be able to recover, to make that insurance claim, to have that police report, and in some cases, people really do need to go to jail. I've been alluding to this the entire presentation, but here's an example of how awful this is and the impact that it has. This is a small church in Muncie, Indiana. There are huge problems. This is a much longer article, but basically the church treasurer allegedly embezzled money, and it really, as this person says, tore the church apart. It is deeply personal when it happens. People take great offense to this type of action, and oftentimes it's the aftermath that becomes so difficult to reconcile and move on that it basically drives people away. question of many people want to forgive, some people want to forget it, some people want to throw the book at them. How is it possible to reconcile what's happened, but also to ensure that it doesn't happen again? One of the things that I've come up with is this idea that regardless of where you're at, what organization or what religion, most have a forgiveness, a merciful attitude, and that's also part of a sense of justice. So it's not one or the other. It is two equal parts: justice, and then equity. And when those are broken, there does need to be a forgiveness. However, there are many issues that require, from an equitable perspective, that people who committed a crime, a fraud, need to be held to account. They need that first in order for justice to be served, in order for equity to be restored. And once that is restored, then there is the ability to have forgiveness. Unfortunately, it becomes so fractured, it really harms the community at large. We see in the research a lot of justifications, a lot of downplaying, diminishing of what happened, lots of blame. This is hugely a blame game. And then, of course, there are these ideas that, well, if I just pay the money back, then nothing bad, quote unquote bad, criminal or civil will happen. And unfortunately, that just doesn't always work. Again, many religions also look at the fact that they're having knowledge of this, even minimal knowledge of what's going on, and not doing anything about it is essentially as bad as committing the fraud or the theft itself. A lot of issues revolve around this. When you look at forgiveness, in order for forgiveness to happen, it must be conditioned on generally four principles. So first of all, there must be a full and complete admission of the entirety of what took place. The person needs to be very sorrowful, truly contrite, not just crocodile tears or sad that they got caught. Obviously, there has to be a full and complete satisfaction, so an actual financial restitution, but there also must be the acceptance of the punishment for what has happened. And again, this is where the emotions can run very high, because while some people cannot separate the anger of the person from the anger at what occurred, and so there is this blurring of lines. So you can be angry and be upset at what happened and how it happened, but in order to move forward, that you can still be angry at what occurred, working to ensure it doesn't happen again, but then also making sure that the person understands all of these kinds of things, and then having the strength and the courage to be able to move on. That's really important. So let's go through a case study, because I think this is really where it comes into play. So typical nonprofit organizations basically have some kind of governing body, some kind of constitution or bylaws, some type of organizational structure. usually it consists of a board of directors or some other governing group that is able to set the policy and the really try to drive the mission of the organization. And usually this includes the board being responsible, especially on a smaller nonprofit. The board is approving payments usually. There's a treasurer, usually who controls funds, writes checks from the account, and usually there's only one bank account, and there's usually only one checkbook, and there's almost never any reporting. There's never any reconciliation, even though there should be. Usually the bylaws or the Constitution calls for one, monthly meeting or something like that. But unfortunately, it just typically doesn't happen. So let's look at a church. It's a very large church in North Carolina, and this gentleman was he was the headmaster. He was also the church treasurer, and he conspired with the pastor to, over the course of a 14-year period, embezzle $9 million. It's pretty massive. This is probably one of the larger ones. He was also headmaster of the school, so it was a church and a school. And again, this is a long time to move a lot of money. So Wayne Parker is his name. This is a public case. It's been fully adjudicated. He basically had access to 29 checking accounts in the church or the school name. He took 7 personal loans through the church. He had 26 credit cards and 9 limited liability companies. And that is how he and the pastor siphoned $9 million from this church and school. Typical, once things start to unravel, the business records are stolen and destroyed. He fabricated documents. He sold residences and sold assets and hid assets, all in order to minimize any possible problems. Didn't work. They found him. It was a major scandal in that part of the country. This was a very wealthy church, I should also add. So in addition to the homes, plural, that he bought, he took vacations, he brought gifts, he had a very nice car, lots of restaurants. I believe he had a boat and a personal watercraft. He also paid some of his taxes from this money and used credit cards and other things to buy personal items. But he also had tickets to the Carolina Panthers NFL team and bought gold coins and other very nice items. So this is a LA Times article that basically shows that this individual impersonated a priest, a Catholic priest. And again, this apparently is a issue. So in Los Angeles, the Archdiocese keeps a list of unauthorized priests and deacons, which is almost 100 people. So this is kind of the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will, where the person is trying to use the position to gain the trust and then extract money from unsuspecting churchgoers who are simply looking for spiritual help or guidance or leadership. And again, we've talked about some of the issues with connected schools, and so in this case, a 40-year-old school principal, who allegedly stole over $150,000, and you see how she did it. So first of all, issuing checks to herself, that's always an issue that is pretty typical, and again can be found out very quickly by identifying and reviewing the checks and bank statements. Also withdrawing cash, and then using school money to pay off personal debts, and that again, $152,000 over basically a 4-year period is pretty substantial. This is a federal case that's quite interesting because it deals with a pastor who used a federal summer food program for low-income families to defraud and defrauded the federal government, because ultimately that money comes from the federal government. And so this is $60,000 in direct payments to themselves, plus another $10,000 that they gave to relatives. And then basically what they did was paid somewhere north of $70,000 for real estate and a residential for the pastor's parents. So these are all really incredible stories of people who are using this the idea of either religion or some other spiritual issue to prey on people, and that is exactly what they try to do. So we have gone just over about half an hour on this. I thank you for all your hard work and everything you're doing this week, all the assignments. Please keep posting your thoughts and questions. I'd love to hear what you think about this particular video, as well as all the other presentations and videos that we have in this course. So have a wonderful week. I'll leave you with Pope Francis's interesting quote: "There's always a danger of corruption. Instead of being devoted to faith, people become dominated by money and power." And if that is not the truth from the beginning of time, probably that I don't know what is. Ego, greed, money, power. It does sadly corrupt, even with people who have start out with good intentions. But anyway, hope you enjoy this program. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you on the discussion boards.